The Seaside Promise. Chapter 1. The Tide of First Meetings. The salt-scrubbed wind off the Merrow Sea carried the cries of gulls and the distant clang of a ship's bell. In the town of Porthlunner, where whitewashed cottages clung to the cliffs like barnacles and the tide carved fresh secrets into the shore each day, life moved at the pace of the waves, slow, rhythmic, and forgiving. It was a place for people who had nowhere else to go, or who had chosen to stop running. Miss Lillian Shaw was decidedly the latter. She stood at the edge of the promenade, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder and a battered sketchbook tucked under her arm. Her chestnut hair, shot through with threads of copper in the afternoon light, escaped from its ribbon and whipped across her face. She did not bother to tuck it back. Instead, she closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of brine and drying nets, of wet sand and distant honeysuckle. This was not London. There were no soot-choked alleys here, no condescending gallery owners who looked at her watercolours as though they were pleasant but irrelevant. Here, the horizon was endless, and the light shifted from silver to gold to lavender with a generosity she had never known. "You'll catch your death," said a voice behind her, low and dry as August bracken. Lillian turned. A man stood a few paces away, holding a black medical bag and wearing an expression that suggested he had been called out to a particularly tedious emergency. He was tall, lean-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if it were not so carefully arranged into a mask of polite indifference. His hair was dark, silvered at the temples, and his eyes, grey as the winter sea, were fixed on her with something between curiosity and disapproval. "I beg your pardon," she said, standing there, no coat, the wind's coming in from the northeast. That's a February chill in an October wind. He glanced at the sky as though it had personally offended him. "You'll be coughing by supper." Lillian laughed, a real, unguarded sound that seemed to startle him as much as it did her. "You must be the town physician." His mouth tightened. "Dr. Henry Whitcomb. And you are the new resident of the Coast Guard cottage, I take it. The one who arrived on the morning coach." News travels fast in Porthlunner. News travels at the speed of Mrs. Polgrane's tongue, which is to say, faster than light. He shifted his bag to his other hand. "She informed me at the bakery that you are a painter, Miss Lillian Shaw. And here I thought I might enjoy a week of anonymity." Henry's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a glint of humour, quickly suppressed. "Anonymity in Porthlunner is a myth, like dry summers or polite gossip. You would do better to accept it now." Lillian tilted her head, studying him with the same attention she might give a difficult composition. There was a tightness around his jaw, a weariness in the set of his shoulders that spoke of long nights and longer silences. She had seen such faces before. In the waiting rooms of hospitals, in the pews of city churches, on the features of men who had loved and lost and resolved never to be caught off guard again. "I'll risk the cough," she said, turning back to the sea. "The light is too beautiful to waste on good sense." She expected him to leave. Physicians were busy men, and this one radiated the particular impatience of someone who had learned that lingering led to disappointment. But he did not move. After a moment, she heard the soft crunch of his boots on the shingle as he stepped up beside her. "The light," he repeated as though testing a foreign word. "What do you see that the rest of us miss?" It was not mockery. That surprised her. Most people asked about her art the way they asked about the weather, politely with no intention of remembering the answer. But Henry Whitcomb's question had the weight of genuine curiosity, however reluctantly offered. Lillian gestured to the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent, bleeding ochre and rose into the clouds. "Look at the water, just there, where the shallows turn to deep. It isn't blue. It's green and grey and violet all at once. But your eye wants to call it blue because that's what you expect. The sea is a liar, Dr. Whitcomb. It shows you one thing and hides a dozen others beneath. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. I have lived in Porthluna for 6 years. I have stood on this promenade perhaps 1,000 times. I have never seen it that way. Then you haven't been looking. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a small, reluctant thing like a crack in a dam. No, he admitted. I suppose I haven't. They stood together in silence as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades Lillian was already committing to memory. She did not know then that this moment would become one she would return to again and again, like a shell held to the ear, listening for the echo of something that had not yet begun. That evening, Lillian unpacked her few belongings in the Coast Guard cottage. It was a modest dwelling, 2 rooms downstairs, a narrow bedroom above, and a window that faced the sea with the single-minded devotion of a lover. The previous tenant had left behind a cast-iron stove, a pine table scarred by years of use, and a faint smell of tobacco and wood smoke. It was perfect. She set up her easel by the window, propped a blank canvas against it, and sat for a long while with her sketchbook open on her lap. The cottage had no gaslight, only oil lamps, and the shadows they cast were deep and intimate. She began to draw, not the sea, not the sunset, but the face of the man she had met on the promenade, the hard line of his jaw, the careful distance in his eyes, the way he had said her name, Miss Lillian Shaw, as though it were a diagnosis he was still considering. She was not a portraitist by trade. Her work leaned toward landscapes, toward the play of light on water, toward the moods of the sky. But her pencil moved of its own accord, capturing the physician's guarded features with a tenderness that surprised her. When she finished, she studied the drawing in the lamplight and felt the faint stirring of something she had not expected to find in Porthluna, a story waiting to be told. The next morning, Lillian walked into town to buy supplies. Porthluna's high street was a single cobbled lane lined with shops that had served the same families for generations. Polgrain's bakery, Trevorrow's grocery, and a bookshop called the Wrecker's Shelf that smelled of old paper and secrets. She was examining a display of local honey when she heard the bell of the surgery door open across the street. Henry Whitcomb emerged, minus his medical bag, but carrying a cup of tea that steamed in the cool air. He saw her, hesitated, then gave a short nod of acknowledgement. Miss Shaw. No cough, I see. Disappointed? Relieved. I dislike being right about such things. He crossed the street with the unhurried gait of a man who had learned that rushing solved nothing. Up close, she noticed the shadows beneath his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he raised the teacup. He had not slept well. She wondered if anyone ever did, in a house as quiet as his surely was. I wondered, she said, if you might recommend a place to paint, somewhere with good light and not too many onlookers. He considered this. The headland beyond the lifeboat station. You'll have the gulls for company and the tide pools for subject matter. But stay clear of the eastern edge. The cliff is unstable there. You sound like you've spent time with artists before. I spent time with a woman who painted once. The words came out flat, stripped of emotion, but Lillian heard the echo of something beneath, a door slamming shut, a key turning in a lock. She preferred mountains to the sea. We did not agree on much. Before she could ask more, he raised a hand in farewell and walked back toward the surgery, his footsteps steady on the cobblestones. Lillian watched him go, and in the privacy of her own mind, she added a new line to the portrait she had drawn the night before. A shadow behind the eyes, the shape of a loss he would not name. For 2 weeks, Lillian fell into the rhythm of Porthluna. She rose with the sun, painted until her fingers cramped, and walked the cliffs each evening as the tide turned. The townspeople were kind in the way of small communities, curious but not intrusive, generous with soup and gossip in equal measure. Mrs. Polgrain at the bakery had already decided that Lillian was a sensible sort, not like that flighty creature who rented the cottage last summer and tried to start a commune. Mr. Trevorrow at the grocery slipped her an extra apple every time she visited, his wife having recently discovered a passion for watercolours and hoping for a lesson. Lillian gave the lesson freely, and then another, and soon found herself with a small but devoted following of amateur painters who gathered on the beach each Thursday with mismatched brushes and high hopes. She taught them how to mix cerulean from cobalt and white, how to capture the weight of a wave, how to see the green in the grey. It was not the career she had imagined in London, with its galleries and critics and champagne receptions, but it was, she realised with a start, happier. Henry Whitcomb watched this from a distance. He did not paint, he did not linger on the beach or attend Thursday gatherings. But he walked the promenade each evening at the same hour, and Lillian noticed that his route had begun to include a pause by the bench where she often sat to clean her brushes. "You're avoiding the headland," he said one evening, nodding toward the canvas she had propped against the bench. It showed the harbour at low tide, the fishing boats resting on mudflats like sleeping animals. "The light was better here today. The light is always better on the headland. You're avoiding something else." She looked up at him, surprised by his perception. He was not looking at her, but at the painting, his grey eyes moving across the canvas with an attention she had only ever seen in other artists. "The headland has a view of your surgery window," she said. "I didn't want you to think I was watching you." A beat of silence. Then, to her astonishment, he laughed, a short, rough sound, as if he had forgotten how. "Miss Shaw, everyone in Porthlana watches everyone. It's the town sport. If you wish to paint the headland, paint it. I shall close my curtains if my modesty requires it." "Your modesty?" She grinned. "I didn't think physicians had any." "We don't. It's a professional hazard." He sat on the bench beside her, not close, but not as far as he might have. "How is the painting going? The real painting, I mean, not the harbour scene." She blinked. "How do you know there's a real painting?" "Because you have the look of someone who is thinking about something else. You smile at your work, but sometimes you frown at the horizon. That's not the expression of a woman painting fishing boats." Lillian set down her brush. She had not spoken to anyone about the painting that consumed her, the one she worked on in the small hours when the rest of Porthlana slept. It was a large canvas, ambitious in scale and mood, and it showed the sea in storm. Not the pretty postcard sea of summer, but the churning, hungry sea of winter, when waves battered the cliffs and the wind screamed through the chimney pots. She had begun it on her second night in the cottage, driven by something she could not name, and she had worked on it every night since. "It's a storm," she said quietly. "The worst I've ever seen. I'm trying to capture the feeling of being small, of standing at the edge of something enormous and knowing it could swallow you whole." Henry was very still. When he spoke, his voice was low. "And is that how you feel? Small?" "Sometimes. In London I felt like a pebble on a beach full of stones, indistinguishable, replaceable. I thought coming here would change that." She gestured to the harbour, the cottages, the steady lights coming on in the windows. "And it has, in a way. I'm no longer indistinguishable. But I'm still trying to understand what I'm doing here, what I'm meant to be." He turned to look at her then, and for the first time the mask slipped. She saw the man beneath, tired, yes, and guarded, but also curious and kind and terribly, terribly alone. "You're meant to paint," he said simply. "That much is obvious to anyone with eyes." She held his gaze. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain, and somewhere behind them a door banged shut. "And you, Dr. Whitcomb, what are you meant to be?" The mask slid back into place, but not before she saw the crack. "A physician," he said. "That is enough." He stood, nodded once, and walked away into the gathering dusk. Lillian watched him go, and on the canvas before her, the storm began to take on a new shape, less abstract now, more personal. She picked up her brush and began to paint the grey of his eyes. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silence. The storm came 3 days later, not on canvas but in earnest. It roared in from the sea with a fury that rattled windows and sent fishing boats scrambling for harbour. Rain lashed the cobblestones, and the wind tore slates from roofs and laughter from the mouths of children. Porthlana battened down, drew its curtains, and waited for the sky to exhaust itself. Lillian loved it. She stood at her window with a cup of tea gone cold, watching the waves hurl themselves against the seawall. The spray reached as high as the lampposts, and the air tasted of salt and ozone. Her storm painting, still unfinished, seemed almost timid by comparison. Nature, she realized, did not ask for permission. It simply was, violent and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the small creatures who huddled in its shadow. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Henry Whitcomb, rain streaming from the brim of his hat, his coat dark with water. He was not carrying his medical bag. "Dr. Whitcomb, is someone ill?" "No." He hesitated, rain dripping from his chin. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, and he entered, shaking his hat against the doorframe. The cottage felt smaller with him inside. His height seemed to fill the room, and his presence brought with it a gravity that shifted the air. He stood by the stove, warming his hands, and looked at the easel by the window. "The storm," he said. "It's good. Better than good." "It's not finished." "It won't be. That's the nature of storms. They don't finish, they just pass." Lillian poured him a cup of tea, more to have something to do with her hands than out of hospitality. He accepted it without thanks, his eyes still on the canvas. "You didn't come to discuss my painting," she said. "No." He set down the teacup and turned to face her. In the lamplight, his expression was unreadable, a closed book with a broken spine. "I came to apologize." "For what?" "For the other evening, on the bench. You asked me what I was meant to be, and I told you a lie, not a deliberate one, but a lie all the same." Lillian waited. The wind moaned around the cottage, and somewhere upstairs, a loose shutter banged against the wall. She did not prompt him. She had learned, in her years of sketching strangers on park benches and railway platforms, that silence was sometimes the only invitation a person needed. Henry pulled off his wet coat and draped it over the back of a chair. Beneath it, he wore a simple waistcoat and shirt sleeves, and without the armour of his outer layers, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "I was married," he said. "Her name was Clara. She was a painter. Landscapes, mostly. Mountains, as I said. We met in Edinburgh, where I was completing my training. She was the most alive person I had ever known." Lillian sank onto the wooden settle by the stove, drawing her knees up beneath her. She did not speak. "We were happy for a time, or I thought we were, but Clara had a restlessness that no marriage could cure. She needed new horizons, new mountains, new light. And I—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "I needed stability. A practice. A town where I could put down roots. We tried to compromise, but compromise is just a slower way of disappointing each other." "What happened?" Lillian asked softly. "She left. 3 years ago. Not dramatically. No slammed doors or burning letters. She simply packed her bags one morning while I was at the surgery and caught the train to Inverness. She left a note on the kitchen table. 'I'm sorry, I love you, but I can't breathe here.'" He laughed, a bitter sound. "I came to Porthlana because it was as far from mountains as I could get without leaving the country. A petty revenge, I suppose. She took the highlands. I took the sea." The rain hammered the window. Lillian thought of the portrait she had drawn on her first night, the shadow behind his eyes, the shape of a loss he would not name. She had been right, but being right brought her no satisfaction. "You blame yourself," she said. "I blame us both. That's the cruelest part. There's no villain, no single moment where it all went wrong, just two people who wanted different things and couldn't find a way to want them together." He rubbed his face with both hands, and when he lowered them, his composure had returned, though thinner than before. "I tell you this because you asked, and because you deserved an honest answer, and because—" He hesitated. "Because you paint storms, Miss Shaw. You understand that some things cannot be controlled." Lillian rose from the settle and crossed to the window. Outside, the sea was a chaos of white and grey, the horizon erased by rain. "I understand that some things cannot be fixed," she said quietly, "but that doesn't mean they aren't worth facing." Henry said nothing. After a long moment, he retrieved his coat from the chair and shrugged it back on. "Thank you for the tea. And for listening. I should go. Mrs. Hennessy's rheumatism will be acting up in this weather, and she'll send for me before midnight." "Henry." He stopped at the door, his hand on the latch. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him register it, a small shock, like a stone dropped into still water. "You didn't lie," she said. "Not to me and not to yourself. You're a physician, that is enough, but it's not all you are." He held her gaze for a long, breathless moment. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the storm, and the wind swallowed him whole. The weeks that followed were a study in careful distances. Henry continued his evening walks, and Lillian continued to paint by the window, and they continued to find reasons to occupy the same bench at the same hour. They spoke of small things, the quality of the light, the stubbornness of Mrs. Polgrain's cat, the latest antics of the Thursday painting circle. They did not speak of Clara, or of London, or of the storm that was taking shape on Lillian's largest canvas. But something had shifted between them, like a stone turned over by the tide, revealing the wet sand beneath. Henry began to linger longer. Lillian found herself saving questions for him. Questions about the town's history, about the names of the fishing boats, about the constellations that emerged on clear nights. She learned that he played the cello, badly but with feeling, and that he had a secret fondness for Mrs. Polgrain's saffron buns. He learned that she had been an orphan, raised by an aunt who had discouraged her art, and that she had come to Porthlunner with exactly £73 and a hope that had no rational basis. £73, he said one evening as they watched the sunset set the harbour ablaze. "That's not a fortune. It's enough for a start. And if the start doesn't lead anywhere—" She smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "Then I'll find another start." "That's the thing about hope, Dr. Whitcomb. It's not a plan. It's a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Wonder, perhaps, or envy, or something else entirely. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, I would have stayed in London and married the solicitor my aunt chose for me, and I would be painting watercolours of teacups in a house that smelled of beeswax and regret." She laughed. "I chose the sea instead. I chose the risk." "And if the sea chooses to drown you?" "Then I'll drown knowing I was alive." Henry shook his head slowly, but he was smiling, a real smile, not the reluctant crack she had seen before, but a full, unguarded expression that transformed his face. "You are the most terrifying woman I have ever met." "Good," she said. "Terrifying is memorable." The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday. Lillian was on the beach with her painting circle, helping Mrs. Trevorrow with a particularly obstinate perspective, when she noticed Henry's surgery door open across the street. A woman she did not recognize stood on the threshold, weeping into a handkerchief. Henry spoke to her in low, urgent tones, his hand on her arm. Then he looked up, across the cobblestones, and his eyes met Lillian's. She saw it immediately. The mask was back, but it was cracked, not by humour this time, but by something darker. Fear. She excused herself from the painting circle and crossed the street. The weeping woman had gone, and Henry stood alone in the doorway, his face grey. "What is it?" Lillian asked. He did not answer immediately. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, as though trying to memorize the shape of her against the light. Then he said, "That was Mrs. Polgrane's niece. She came from Exeter with her husband 2 weeks ago. He's been unwell, fatigue, weight loss, a cough that wouldn't quit. I thought it was influenza. But the tests came back today." "Henry, what is it?" "Consumption," he said, advanced, "and I missed it." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into deep water. Lillian felt the cold spread through her chest. Consumption, the white plague, the disease that filled lungs with fluid and hope with despair. She had seen it in London, in the crowded tenements where the poor coughed their lives away on straw mattresses. It was not supposed to come to Porthluna with its clean air and salt spray and sturdy fishing folk. "You didn't miss it," she said. "You said yourself, the symptoms mimic influenza. You ordered the tests." "Too late. If I had recognized it sooner, if I had—" He broke off, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. "I am a physician. My entire purpose is to see what others miss. And I failed." Lillian reached out and took his hands, pulling them away from his face. His fingers were cold. "Listen to me. You are one man. You cannot cure every illness, catch every sign, save every life. That is not failure, that is being human. Human is not good enough. It is the only thing we have." He stared at her, his grey eyes bright with something that was not quite tears. The rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Behind them, the sea whispered its endless, patient secrets. "Stay," Lillian said softly. "Just for a while. Don't go back to your empty surgery and your silent house. Stay here, with me." He did not answer, but he did not let go of her hands, either. And when she led him up the path to the Coast Guard cottage, he followed. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. They did not speak of what happened that afternoon, not in words. But something shifted, a tectonic movement beneath the surface of their careful friendship. Henry stayed until the lamplighters made their rounds, and Lillian made him eat a bowl of fish stew that Mrs. Polgrane had left on her doorstep. He sat at her pine table, turning the spoon in his hands, and she sat across from him, sketching him in the margin of a newspaper. "You're drawing me," he said. "You're drawing yourself. I'm just recording it." He almost smiled. "And what do you see?" She turned the newspaper around so he could see the sketch, a few swift lines that captured the slope of his shoulders, the downturn of his mouth, the way his hands held the spoon as though it were something precious. "I see a man who carries too much," she said, "and who has forgotten that he is allowed to set it down." Henry looked at the sketch for a long moment. Then he folded the newspaper carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. "May I keep this?" "It's yours." He nodded, stood, and walked to the door, but at the threshold, he paused. "Lillian." It was the first time he had used her name without the formality of Miss Shaw. She felt it like a warmth spreading through her chest. "Yes? You asked me once what I was meant to be. I think perhaps I am meant to be someone who learns from you." He did not wait for a response. He opened the door and stepped out into the twilight, and Lillian stood in the doorway long after he had gone, the salt wind cooling her cheeks. The consumption spread. It was not an epidemic, not yet, but it was a shadow that grew with each passing week. The man from Exeter worsened, and then his wife began to cough, and then a fisherman who had shared a drink with him at the Shipwright's Arms developed a fever that would not break. Henry worked himself to the bone, making house calls at all hours, writing letters to the sanatorium in Truro, sitting up with the sick while their families slept in fitful chairs. Lillian saw him less and less. When she did, he looked thinner, more drawn, the shadows beneath his eyes dark as bruises. She tried to help. She boiled linens, delivered meals, sat with children whose parents were too ill to hold them. The painting circle became a nursing circle, and the Thursday gatherings moved from the beach to the homes of the afflicted. Mrs. Trevorrow's watercolours were abandoned in favour of poultices, and Mrs. Polgrain's saffron buns were replaced by broth. Through it all, Henry remained a presence at the edges of her vision. A coat disappearing around a corner, a lamp bobbing through the fog, a voice calling instructions from the bottom of the stairs. They exchanged notes more often than words. Mrs. Hennessy's fever is down. The fisherman's wife needs more quinine. I will be late. Do not wait up. But Lillian waited. She always waited. The breaking point came on a night in late November, when the wind carried the first true chill of winter and the sea was the colour of slate. Lillian was in her cottage, adding the final touches to her storm painting, when a knock came at the door, not the polite rap of a visitor, but an urgent, desperate pounding. She opened it to find Mrs. Polgrain, her apron stained with something dark, her face blotched with weeping. "It's the doctor," she gasped. "He's collapsed. At the surgery. I found him on the floor. He won't wake up, miss. He won't wake up." Lillian did not remember putting on her coat or running through the streets. She remembered only the cold air burning her lungs and the sound of her own heart hammering in her ears. The surgery door stood open, and inside, Henry lay on the floor of his consultation room, his face as pale as the paper on his desk. She knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his neck. His pulse was there, thready, irregular, but there. His skin was hot to the touch. Fever, exhaustion, the accumulated weight of weeks without sleep, days without food, the relentless grind of watching his patients suffer while he poured himself out like water. "Help me get him to the couch," she said to Mrs. Polgrain, and together they lifted him, heavier than he looked, all bone and sinew, and laid him on the leather couch where he had examined so many others. For 3 days, Lillian did not leave his side. She slept in the chair by his couch, waking every hour to check his temperature, to press a cool cloth to his forehead, to dribble water between his cracked lips. Mrs. Polgrain brought broth and bread. Mr. Trevorrow looked in to ask if there was anything he could do. The patients, those who were well enough to walk, left notes at the door, small offerings of gratitude, a jar of honey, a knitted blanket, a child's drawing of a ship. On the second night, Henry's fever broke. He opened his eyes, unfocused and confused, and for a terrible moment, Lillian thought he did not recognize her. Then his hand found hers, and his fingers curled around her own with a strength that surprised her. "You're still here," he whispered. "I'm still here." "You shouldn't be. You'll catch it." "Then I'll catch it. I'm not leaving." He closed his eyes again, but he did not let go of her hand. And when he slept, it was the deep, dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted, the first real rest he had had in weeks. On the 3rd day, he sat up. He was weak, gaunt, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. But his eyes were clear, and when he looked at Lillian, the mask was gone entirely. She saw him, all of him, the fear and the hope and the terrible, beautiful vulnerability of a man who had spent years building walls and was beginning to realize that walls kept out the cold, but also the light. "You saved my life," he said. "I gave you broth and badgered you into sleeping. That's not medicine, that's nagging." "It's more than medicine. It's—" He stopped, searching for words. "I have spent 6 years in Porthlana keeping everyone at arm's length. I told myself it was professionalism. I told myself it was self-preservation. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" of needing someone, of needing anyone. Clara left, and I decided that the only way to never be hurt again was to never be close again. I became a physician because it allowed me to care for people without caring about them. A clinical distance, a safe remove. Lillian sat on the edge of the couch, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder. And now? He turned to look at her, and his grey eyes held none of the winter sea. They held the summer sky instead, warm, open, terrifying in their honesty. And now I am sitting here, alive, because a woman I have known for less than 2 months refused to let me drown. And I am trying very hard not to be afraid of what that means. What does it mean? He reached up and touched her face, a light, almost reverent brush of his fingertips against her cheek. It means, he said softly, that I am falling in love with you, and that terrifies me more than any fever, any storm, any loss I have ever known. Lillian's breath caught. She had imagined this moment 100 times, on the bench, by the window, in the small hours when sleep would not come. But imagination had not prepared her for the reality of his hand on her face, of his voice saying the words aloud, of the way the world seemed to hold its breath around them. "Henry," she said, and his name was a prayer and a promise all at once. "I am not Clara. I am not going to leave you a note on the kitchen table and disappear into the mountains. I am going to stay, here, in Porthlana, by the sea, for as long as you will have me. And if I can't promise you safety, if I can't promise you that I won't work myself into the ground again, that I won't be difficult and distant and afraid." She smiled, the same smile she had given him on the promenade, the first day, when he had warned her about the wind. "I don't want safety, I want you. Difficult, distant, afraid, all of it. I am an artist, Dr. Whitcomb. I know that the most beautiful things are also the most fragile. I am not asking you to be perfect. I am asking you to be here." He pulled her close then, and she went willingly, her cheek against his chest, his arms around her shoulders. The surgery was quiet. The sea whispered beyond the window, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour, a small, steady sound, like a heartbeat, like a promise. Chapter 4. The Seaside Promise. Spring came slowly to Porthlana that year, as though the winter had been reluctant to release its hold. But come it did, in daffodils that pushed through the damp earth, and in mornings when the light had a soft golden quality that made Lillian reach for her brushes before breakfast. The consumption, too, had loosened its grip. The man from Exeter was weak but recovering. His wife had never developed more than a mild cough. The fisherman was back on his boat, grumbling about the price of bait. Henry had not saved everyone. There were 2 graves in the churchyard that had not been there in autumn, but he had saved enough. And for the first time in 6 years, he allowed himself to feel that that was enough. Lillian finished her storm painting on the first day of April. It was not the painting she had set out to make. The storm was still there, the churning sea, the bruised sky, the sense of being small in the face of something enormous. But at the centre of the canvas, almost hidden in the spray, were 2 figures standing on a headland. They were not facing the storm. They were facing each other. She did not show it to anyone for a week. She propped it on her easel and looked at it from every angle, in every light, trying to decide if it was her best work or her worst. It was certainly her most personal. Every brushstroke carried the weight of the autumn, of the winter, of the nights she had spent by Henry's bedside, and the mornings she had watched him walk to the surgery, his step lighter than it had been. On the 8th day, she brought him to the cottage. He stood before the canvas in silence for a long time. She watched his face, looking for the mask, but the mask did not come. Instead, his expression shifted through a dozen emotions: surprise, recognition, wonder, and finally something that looked like peace. "That's us," he said, "on the headland." "It's us," she agreed. We're not running from the storm. No, we're not. He turned to her, and she saw that his eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the sheen of a man who had spent years denying himself the right to feel and was now overwhelmed by the sheer volume of what he had been suppressing. You painted this because of me. I painted this because of us, because of what we are to each other, because of what you showed me, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her face in his hands. This time, when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no clinical distance, no safe remove. There was only the warmth of his mouth on hers, the strength of his hands in her hair, the quiet certainty that this was what he had been running from and running toward all along. They were married in July in the little stone church that overlooked the harbour. Mrs. Polgrain baked the cake. Mr. Trevorrow provided the flowers. The Thursday painting circle served as bridesmaids, their mismatched dresses a riot of colour against the whitewashed walls, and the sea, ever the heart of Porthluna, provided the music, the steady rhythm of waves on shingle, the cry of gulls, the distant bell of a buoy marking the channel. Henry wore a new suit, the first he had bought in years. Lillian wore a dress the colour of seafoam, her chestnut hair loose beneath a crown of wildflowers. They spoke their vows in voices that carried to the back of the church, where the fishermen sat in their Sunday best and the children squirmed on hard wooden pews. I promise to see you, Henry said, his grey eyes steady on hers. Not the version of you I imagine, not the version I fear, but you, as you are, in storm and in stillness. I promise to stay, Lillian replied, not because it is easy, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because you are my horizon now, and I will spend the rest of my life walking toward you. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife. The church erupted in applause, and as they walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, Lillian caught a glimpse of her storm painting, which she had hung in the vestibule for the occasion. The 2 figures on the headland were still facing each other, but in the light of the summer afternoon, filtered through stained glass, they seemed to be smiling. They built their life together by the sea. It was not a life without challenges. Henry's work was never done. There were always new patients, new illnesses, new nights when he came home with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Lillian's art was never finished. There were always new storms to paint, new skies to capture, new colours to mix in the small hours. But they faced it all together, the griefs and the joys, the quiet evenings by the stove, and the wild mornings when the wind rattled the windows. In time, Lillian's reputation grew. A gallery in St. Ives agreed to show her work, and then a gallery in Bristol, and then, miraculously, a gallery in London. She did not go back for the opening. She sent her storm painting instead, and the critics called it a masterpiece of emotional honesty and a visceral exploration of human fragility. She read the reviews aloud to Henry on the bench by the promenade, and he listened with a smile that had long since lost its reluctance. In time, Henry learned to rest. He hired an assistant, a young physician from Plymouth, eager and earnest, and began to take Sundays off. He and Lillian walked the cliffs on those Sundays, from the Coast Guard cottage to the headland and back again, their fingers intertwined, their conversation ranging from the trivial to the profound. He played his cello in the evenings, badly but with feeling, and she painted him as he played, capturing the furrow of his brow and the curl of his fingers around the bow. And in time they became part of Porthlana, not as outsiders, not as visitors, but as the town's own. Mrs. Polgrain referred to them as our doctor and our artist, as though they had been there all along. The Thursday painting circle continued, now meeting in the surgery's waiting room when the weather was poor. And the storm painting hung in the church vestibule, a reminder to all who passed that even the darkest skies eventually give way to light. One evening, years later, Lillian stood on the promenade as the sun set over the Merrow Sea. The light was extraordinary, gold and rose and violet, the kind of light that made her fingers itch for a brush. Beside her, Henry stood with his hands in his pockets, his grey hair now more silver than dark, his face lined with the evidence of a life fully lived. "Do you remember," he said, "the first time we stood here? You told me the sea was a liar, that it showed one thing and hid a dozen others beneath." "I remember." "I thought you were the strangest woman I had ever met." She laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And now?" He kissed her temple, soft and sure. "Now I think you were right. About the sea. About everything." He paused, watching the waves roll in. "I spent so many years hiding what was beneath. The fear, the grief, the hope I was too afraid to name. And then you came along with your paintbrushes and your storms, and you refused to look away." "That's what artists do," Lillian said. "We see what others miss." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared, faint and trembling. Behind them, the lights of Porthlana flickered to life, one by one, like promises kept. Henry turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I made you a promise," he said. "On our wedding day, I promised to see you, and I have. Every day, every storm, every stillness. And I promised to stay," she said. "And I have." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and the distant sound of laughter from the shipwright's arms. Somewhere in the darkness, a nightingale began to sing. Henry squeezed her hands. "Then let's go home." They walked back along the promenade, past the bench where they had first sat together, past the surgery with its warm light in the window, past the church where the storm painting hung in the vestibule, waiting for morning. The Coast Guard cottage glowed ahead, its windows bright against the dark. Lillian Shaw, Lillian Whitcomb now, paused at the threshold and looked back at the sea. The tide was coming in, covering the day's footprints, erasing and remaking the shore as it had for millennia. Nothing lasted, she thought. But that was all right. The point was not to last. The point was to be here, now, with the salt wind in her hair, and the man she loved waiting by the door. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her, and the sea, patient and eternal, continued its endless work of carving promises into the shore. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the little